Okay, everybody, welcome. I'm Janet Gornick. I think you know that by now. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to just speak for just really a very few minutes to introduce you to the Stone Lecture series and also to the speaker for today. So for those of you who were here yesterday in the welcome session, I explained that the Liss Center was renamed and expanded in September of this past year following a gift from two Boston-based philanthropists, Jim and Kathy Stone, who were enormously generous and helped us to form the Stone Center. So the Stones are with us today, Jim and Kathy in the front row. Thank you, and we're happy that they're with us today. They visited us a few times before. So before there was the Stone Center, there were in fact the Stones. And I met Jim in the spring of 2014, and he had a very long-standing interest in inequality, and we had a long discussion about Liss and the Liss data and income inequality and wealth inequality, and they made a small gift to us to support the data construction in Luxembourg, which is always very much appreciated. As those of you who are in the data business know, it's not that easy to find funding for data infrastructure. And then after that, before we got to the larger business of the Stone Center, Jim and with Kathy, they approached us and asked if we would build a lecture series focused specifically on wealth inequality. And their particular interest, or Jim's interest certainly, is especially about the top of the wealth distribution. He's very concerned about the sequestering of wealth, the lack of intergenerational mobility that's due to sort of the hoarding of wealth. He's interested in taxation and many other issues. So we founded this lecture series with support from them, and this is the inaugural Stone Lecture, and it will take place once a year here at the, now later than now we have the Stone Center, but it'll take place here at the Graduate Center. So we had a rather informal selection committee which unfolded this way. It consisted of me and Jim, and I said, how about Gabriel Zucman? And he said, great, and that's kind of what happened. And he said, do you think we'll get him? And I said, we'll see. So we sent him an email, and voila. So we would be interested in getting suggestions for next year, but at this point it was an informal process, but we were really delighted. Right around the time that we were thinking about the inaugural lecture, Gabriel's book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, The Scourge of Tax Havens, had come out and was, of course, capturing a tremendous amount of attention, including our own. So we're so pleased that he was able to come, and I'm also very thankful to ECINEQ for allowing us to place the Stone Lecture in the middle of this already very crowded program. So they had put the keynotes together, and they allowed us to, quite enthusiastically I might add, to schedule this inaugural Stone Lecture in the middle of the ECINEQ lecture so you all could hear that. So without further ado, there's a lot of, Gabriel has a very informative website, and of course everybody can find biographies online, but let me just mention that he, of course, is an economist, was educated in France as undergraduate, and then master's and PhD from the Paris School of Economics, and received his PhD in July of 2013. And after doing a few other things in between, he's now assistant professor of economics at UC Berkeley. I know a lot of you, as I said, will know his work. He's done a lot of very pioneering work, especially with on his own and with many colleagues, and with Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez. And as I said again, I think the book that most of us know him for, the work is the book, The Hidden Wealth of Nations, which has been translated into many languages and received just extraordinarily good reviews in the popular press as well as in the academic press. And it has been translated and widely read and widely discussed. So on that note, I don't want to take any more time. Gabriel, welcome. What we're going to do is he's going to speak for about 40 minutes. This session is just 1 hour. And then we'll take questions from the audience, and has asked that our volunteers, of course, can pass the microphones as they did yesterday. And Gabriel's preference is to collect maybe 3 questions before he answers. So welcome. Welcome to New York.
All right. Thank you very much, Janet. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks to the Stone Center. Thanks for all of you for being here today. It's really a pleasure to present this research on tax evasion and inequality. This is research that we've been conducting recently with my co-authors, Niels Johansen and Annette Altatsater. Annette is a professor at the University of Oslo. Niels is a professor at the University of Copenhagen. And in that research, we ask a very simple question, which is, how big is tax evasion in rich, developed countries, and how is it distributed? And broadly speaking, I think it's an important question for a number of reasons. So of course, it matters for tax authorities. They have limited resources. They would like to know who's more likely to evade taxes, if people are more likely to, for instance, evade taxes on tax credits, if fraud on self-employment income is more likely, or if sophisticated forms of tax evasion at the very top of the wealth distribution matter quantitatively. They would like to know so as to better target their enforcement effort. It's a question that matters for tax policy, broadly speaking. Tax evasion, it affects the cost of raising taxes, it redistributes the tax burden, so understanding how big it is, that matters to study these bread and butter public economics issues of who pays what in taxes in particular. And most importantly, it's a question that matters for the study of inequality. So over the last 15 years, scholars have increasingly been relying on tax data to study inequality, and in particular top income and wealth shares. Simon Kuznets was the first one to do that in the 1950s. He was the first economist to look at tabulated income tax returns in the US, to combine those with national accounts data, to estimate top income shares in the US. And what's striking is that basically from Kuznets in the 1950s to Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Tony Atkinson in the late 1990s, early 2000, almost nobody picked up on the Kuznets agenda of using tax data to study trends in top income and wealth shares. Tony was the main and a very important exception, but apart from him, almost nobody did that for all these decades in between Kuznets and the late 1990s. And the reason, one of the key reasons, is that people felt that, of course, tax data is great. We like tax data because they are better than survey data when it comes to capturing the top of the distribution. You have bigger sample sizes. But of course, there's a big issue, which is tax evasion. Top marginal income tax rates that rich people face, the tax evasion technologies that they have access to, the tax enforcement methods that tax authorities implement, all of these have changed enormously over time. The top marginal income tax rate in the US from 0% before 1913 to up to 90% in the post-World War II decades, for instance. They vary a lot across countries. And so it's not clear that we can learn a lot about the trends in income concentration and the cross-country differences in income and wealth concentration just by looking at tax data. So that's a very important issue, and the problem is it is hard to study this well for the very simple reason that you don't have any good data set that's going to tell you here's the total amount of tax evasion and here is who's doing tax evasion. The key data set that's used to study tax evasion today is randomized audit studies, where the IRS, for instance, randomly audits a number of taxpayers, and then it checks whether these taxpayers have duly reported whatever income they've earned and duly paid whatever taxes they're supposed to pay. The big problem is that these random audit studies, they face two key challenges. First, you don't have sufficiently many very wealthy individuals who are sampled. And so it's hard to study tax evasion by people with 10, 50, or $100 million using random audit data. You're simply not going to have sufficiently many rich people in the sample. And the second and more important reason is that even if you have rich people who are randomly audited, tax authorities do not detect well the sophisticated forms of tax evasion that take place at the top of the wealth distribution. It's very hard, for instance, think of someone who's, let's say, hiding assets in Panama. And the IRS does a randomly audits that person. What's the probability that the IRS is going to find out? 0. The IRS is not going to ask all banks all over the world and all providers of offshore services about whether that person is hiding wealth here or there. And so in practice, random audits are good at detecting certain relatively easy to detect forms of tax evasion, but they need to be supplemented by other data sources if you want to capture evasion by the wealthy. Now, until recently, there was no such data, but what has happened is that in recent years, new data have become available that make it possible to study precisely this. And these new data, they come from massive leaks of data from financial institutions located in offshore tax havens. So what we're going to do in this research is to analyze these leaked data. And there are two main leaks. The first one, the most important one, is from HSBC Switzerland, so the Swiss subsidiary of the banking giant HSBC. In 2007, an employee of HSBC Switzerland stole the whole file of all the clients of that Swiss bank, more than 30,000 clients. And in 2008, the French tax authority obtained it. Then it shared this list with foreign country tax authorities when Christine Lagarde, the current managing director of the IMF, was finance minister in France. And so this list became known as the Lagarde list. And so the US, the IRS has it, tax authorities in Scandinavian countries have it. And so what we've been doing is that we've been working with tax authorities in 3 countries, in Sweden, in Norway, and in Denmark, to study, okay, who are the Scandinavian individuals who are hiding assets at HSBC Switzerland? How wealthy are they? And we can study that question because in Scandinavia, the tax and statistical administrations, they collect very good data on individual wealth that makes it possible to compute wealth at the individual level and to rank people in the wealth distribution. So we use that. So these are, if you want, kind of random samples of rich people who've been found hiding assets and doing tax evasion. And so that's going to make it possible to study how concentrated that form of tax evasion is. And then what we do is that we combine this distributional information with estimates of the macroeconomic amount of wealth that's hidden in tax havens to derive some estimates of how much tax evasion takes place in total through tax havens and who does it. We use a second leak, which is the Panama Papers, that corroborates what we see in the HSBC list. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that. And so we combine these leaks with macro estimates and with random audit data to study the size and distribution of total tax evasion. And so here is the key result. So that's a graph that ranks households by their net wealth, so total assets, financial and non-financial, net of debts, in Scandinavia, so 10 million households. And then in each bin of the wealth distribution, what we compute is a simple statistic, which is the following: how much taxes people evade as a fraction of the taxes that they're supposed to pay. And on average, for Scandinavian economies as a whole, tax evasion is just small. The average is around 3%. It's not a big surprise, in modern developed economies, it's just very hard to evade taxes. Most people earn wages or pension income or investment income through domestic banks, and it's just impossible to evade taxes on those forms of income because employers and domestic banks, they provide information to the tax authority. There is what we call third-party reporting that makes tax evasion impossible. In these Scandinavian countries, there's not a lot of self-employment. Generally speaking, as countries develop, the share of self-employment in total economic activity falls. And so mechanically, tax evasion becomes harder and harder for the majority of the population. So that's for the average. But what the graph shows is that when you move up to the very, very top of the wealth distribution, and here we are really zooming into the very top bins of the wealth distribution, then tax evasion rises a lot. In the smallest top group that we consider, the top 0.01% richest households, the 1,000 Scandinavian households with more than $50 million in net wealth, what we find is that the tax evasion here, the rate of tax evasion is 30%. They evade 30% of their true tax liability. And to see substantial rates of tax evasion, you really need to go, to the very top. That is, if you look at people who have 2 million or 5 million or 10 million, you don't see super high rates of tax evasion. It's really at the very top end of the wealth distribution. So let me stress at the outset that the study of tax evasion, is not a perfect science. Obviously, there are lots of uncertainties, and I'm going, in the rest of the presentation, try to explain what are the different sources of uncertainty and, of course, how we obtained those results. I think, the general level and pattern is robust, but as we're going to see, there are, of course, some margins of error. Okay, so let me start with the first step of the analysis, which is, okay, what do we learn from these leaks, the HSBC leak, the Panama Papers that have occurred recently? Let me start with the leak from HSBC Switzerland. So HSBC Switzerland, Swiss subsidiary of HSBC, is the private banking arm of HSBC. HSBC, you all know HSBC, it's this big bank that advertises in all the world's airports. That's one of their ads before the leak, security, security, security. So presumably your account was super safe at HSBC and your financial data, except that there was this big leak. Hervé Falciani, this system engineer, stole the whole file of the 30,000 clients in 2007. So in many ways, for our purposes, it's the perfect leak. It's the perfect leak because HSBC was a big player in the market of offshore wealth management in Switzerland in 2007. It managed about $120 billion on behalf of its clients, which is about 5% of all the wealth managed by Swiss banks on behalf of foreigners. And you have to keep in mind that there are more than 200 Swiss banks. Okay, so a market share of 5% is pretty big. HSBC was probably in the top 10, even maybe in the top 5 biggest Swiss banks at the time of the leak, along with UBS and Credit Suisse in particular. What we know is that HSBC had clients from all over the world in just the same proportion as other Swiss banks. Okay? So it seems to be representative. There's no indication that it was catering to any countries in particular or to particularly wealthy taxpayers. Again, it was advertising in all the world's airports, so maybe it's even possible that its competitors actually had an even wealthier, customer base. So now, first result, what we do is very simple. We compute in each bin of the wealth distribution what's the fraction of Scandinavian households who have a hidden HSBC account. And I forgot to mention a critically important piece of information, which is that the HSBC leak is particularly nice because it gives you a very simple way to assess whether there is tax evasion or not. So having bank accounts abroad is perfectly legal as long as you report those accounts and the earnings that they generate on your tax return. So what we can do is we can check, once we've matched the names on the HSBC list to the tax returns, we can check whether the accounts were duly reported. What we found is that in 90 to 95% of the cases, depending on the country, the accounts were not reported. Okay, so in 5 to 10%, the accounts were duly reported. That's consistent with a whole bunch of information which shows that at the time of the leak in 2007, more than 90% of all the wealth in Switzerland was indeed evading taxes. There's been a couple of reports, for instance, by the US Senate on tax evasion by US citizens through UBS Switzerland and Credit Suisse. They found exactly the same proportion. 90 to 95% of the accounts were undeclared. Credit Suisse had to pay a fine of more than $2 billion. UBS of close to $1 billion. So, HSBC is not an isolated case. Now we can compute the fraction of the population who hides assets by wealth bin. Unsurprisingly, if you are in the bottom 90% or even 99% of the wealth distribution, well, you don't hide assets in Switzerland, okay, so 0%. Now, when you move up the wealth distribution, the probability rises, and it rises steeply within the top 1% and then within the top 0.1% to 1% in the top 0.01% of the wealth distribution. So you have 1% of the wealthiest Scandinavian households who are evading taxes in just that particular bank. It's just one bank, HSBC, in one tax haven, which, as far as we can know, manages 5% of all the wealth in Switzerland, 2% of all the wealth hidden in all the world's tax havens. That's result number one. It's kind of if you want, the extensive margin of tax evasion. Who's more likely to conduct that type of tax evasion? What about the intensive margin that is conditional on hiding assets? How much do you hide? Here, there's no trend that is across the wealth distribution, conditional on hiding assets at HSBC. On average, tax evaders were hiding 40% of their total net wealth in their hidden HSBC account. So few people do tax evasion in general, well, except at the top. When they do it, they do it big. They hide 40% in just one Swiss account. What about the Panama Papers? So the Panama Papers is slightly different in the sense that this is not a leak from a bank, it's a leak from a company, Mossack Fonseca, that creates shell corporations on behalf of customers. And just like for the HSBC leak, we can match the names in the Panama Papers to tax returns. It is, there are a number of limitations compared to the HSBC leak. The main limitation is that although in the HSBC leak we could know whether tax evasion is involved, there was a clear test. For the Panama Papers, it's less clear. There are legal uses of shell corporations. The tax authorities are still investigating whether there is tax evasion or not. So I'm not saying this is 100% tax evasion. What this graph shows, however, is that the use of tax havens by that metric, is even more concentrated than what we could see in the HSBC leak. That is, here, when you look at the top 0.01% of the wealth distribution in Scandinavia, they are 6 times more likely, so these are people with more than $50 million in net wealth, they are 6 times more likely to appear in the Panama Papers than people who only have, in between $10 and $40 million. And below $8 million in net wealth, there's almost nobody in the Panama Papers. Okay, so that's, the use of tax havens is extremely concentrated. What about now a third type of evidence? A third type of evidence comes from tax amnesties. So after the financial crisis, a number of countries have implemented tax amnesties where they say, well, if you were hiding assets, you can use amnesties, you can come clean, and we will reduce penalties. In Sweden and Norway, we have access to a really large sample of people who've used tax amnesties. More than 8,000 households in these two countries have used tax amnesties since 2009. And we can do always the same exercise. Who are they and how do they rank in the wealth distribution? And so it's very similar as what you see in the HSBC leak, with this steep gradient within the top 1%. Notice here just the magnitude, So you have 14% of the richest Scandinavian households who in between 2009 and 2015 just basically said, oops, yes, we were doing tax evasion. Okay, so that's just by their own admission, in just this specific data set. There are interesting differences with the HSBC leak in the sense that here, people who have in between $1 and $3 million in net wealth, they are relatively overrepresented in the Amnesty samples relatively to the HSBC sample. What this suggests is that there is some self-selection into amnesties. Tax amnesties are less good, generally speaking, because they are not random. People choose or not to participate in a tax amnesty, and on a priori grounds, self-selection could go either way. Relatively poorer tax evaders might be more likely to self-select, for instance, if they've inherited hidden accounts and they just want to get rid of it and they're not really actively engaged in tax evasion. Wealthier people might be more likely to self-select if they fear that now the tax authority is going to investigate, to put more resources into investigating really rich people. What we find empirically is that there is some self-selection, but it's mostly relatively poorer tax evaders who are more likely to use tax amnesty than wealthier tax evaders. In any case, the HSBC data and the tax amnesty data are very consistent in that they both show how concentrated the wealth in tax havens is. So that's what this graph shows. This graph shows that the top 0.01% of the wealth distribution in both the Amnesty data set and in the HSBC data set owns about 50% of all the wealth that was hidden. If you add up these two groups, you have the top 0.1% richest households. They own about 80% of all the wealth hidden in tax havens. So of course, dozens of thousands of people at the time of the HSBC leak had, even hundreds of thousands of people had hidden accounts in Switzerland, but what matters quantitatively is tax evasion at the very top end. That is, the top 0.1% accounts for 80% of the wealth hidden. Contrast this now with the distribution of non-hidden wealth, all the rest, real estate, financial assets held through domestic banks, and so on. The top 0.01% in Scandinavia owns about 5% of recorded wealth, 50% of unrecorded wealth. So now if you want to think about the implications that this has for inequality, it's all going to depend on how big the macro stock of wealth in tax havens is. So what do we know about that? I've done some work in previous research about this issue. Now, what we see in the macroeconomic statistics is that Scandinavian countries, they don't have a ton of wealth in tax havens. They are not, generally speaking, the kings of tax evasion. If you rank countries by their share of world GDP and you compare that to their share of the wealth hidden in Switzerland, you see that these Scandinavian countries, they're way below the 45-degree line. They have less wealth in Switzerland than what you would expect just based on their share of world GDP. Countries that have more include, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Spain, France, unfortunately, Italy, and so on. So they don't have so much wealth in tax havens. By my estimate, they have about 2.5% of their total household wealth hidden in tax havens, much less than the global average of about 4%. Now, what are the implications? If in total these countries had 2.5% of their wealth in tax havens, and 80% of this belongs to the top 0.1%, you see that this means that the top 0.1% owns 2% of total wealth in tax havens. And so that's going to increase the top 0.1% wealth share from about 8%, that's what you see in the very high quality statistics that exist currently about wealth inequality in Scandinavia, to about 10%. Okay, what this shows is that the decline in wealth concentration that has happened over the course of the 20th century is actually less pronounced in actual facts than what you see based on uncorrected tax data. And similarly, the rise in wealth inequality in recent decades has been stronger than what you see using uncorrected tax data. That's even more spectacular when you look at the top 0.01%. Here, what we find is basically taking into account offshore wealth, we are back to the levels of wealth concentration of the early 20th century, of the 1930s, something that you don't see using uncorrected tax data, or at least much less clearly. What you also see is that for the top 0.01%, they hide, by our estimate, 25% of their true wealth. So to move from their reported wealth to their true wealth, you need to multiply their reported wealth by a third. All right, let me briefly discuss what all of this implies for tax evasion. So if the top 0.01% hides 25% of its wealth, that's going to imply more or less that it evades about 25% of its tax liability. For the top 0.01%, well, almost all of their income, close to 100% of their income derives from wealth, and so if you hide a quarter, then there's going to be 1/4 of your tax liability that you're not going to pay. Now, here is one attempt at quantifying the margins of error and the uncertainty around these estimates. The main uncertainty is not really about the concentration of hidden wealth, which you see both in the HSBC leak, in the Panama Papers leak, in the Amnesty sample. The main source of uncertainty is how big the macro stock of wealth in tax havens is. It turns out that there's one sure piece of information in all of this, which is Switzerland, for the very simple reason that the Swiss central bank just publishes that information every month. That's disclosed, that's published on the website of the Swiss central bank, just the amount of wealth that foreigners own through Swiss banks. So this lower bound scenario here corresponds to tax evasion by rich people if Scandinavians only have offshore wealth in Switzerland. They have nothing in Luxembourg, in the Cayman Islands, in Jersey, and so on. Okay? So that's a really extreme lower bound scenario. A higher estimate, which is not even an upper bound, corresponds to an estimate where Scandinavian countries as a whole hide abroad as much wealth as the world average, so 4% instead of 2.5%. Okay? Now, if you want to have a complete picture of tax evasion, there's not only tax evasion through offshore intermediaries. There are many other forms of tax evasion. How can we study those? We can look at random audits. In Denmark, in particular, you already have excellent randomized audit data where close to 1% of the population is randomly audited every year, so very big sample sizes. And they do, they devote a lot of resources into really trying to identify whether all income has been duly reported using the vast amount of data that the Danish tax authority collects, in particular about wealth. And so what you see in these random audit studies is you don't see a lot of tax evasion, 2.3% on average. You don't see very clear patterns in tax evasion, maybe a bit of an increase at the very top, around 4%, but it's not very statistically different than what you see in other parts of the wealth distribution. So does it mean that the random audits just are useless, they just don't detect anything? That's not the case. They do detect a lot of mistakes, of forms of tax evasion on tax returns. If you look at the extensive margin, these random audits, they find, for instance, in the top 0.5%, these top 0.5% taxpayers, in 40% of the cases, the tax authority finds some mistakes, some forms of tax evasion. But it's just that the forms of tax evasion that are detected in random audits, they are not big. They are, these are relatively small amounts, and in particular for the reason that I mentioned at the very beginning, that the tax authorities just don't have the resources in the context of their random audit programs to detect really sophisticated forms of tax evasion. So basically what they detect is fraud on self-employment income, tax credits, and things like that. All right. So let me talk a little bit about how we can explain these findings. So how can we, despite the uncertainty, I think there's one thing that's really clear, that there is a steep gradient in evasion within the very top groups in Scandinavia. So the traditional model that economists have to study questions of tax evasion, that's the Allingham-Sandmo model, basically the Baker-Crime model applied to tax evasion, where tax evasion depends on marginal tax rates, on the probability to be caught, and on the penalties paid conditional on being caught. This model is not going to be very helpful in understanding why tax evasion rises when you move from 10 to 50 to $100 million. Why? Because people at these wealth levels, they all face the same marginal tax rates. And very, very wealthy people, if anything, they are much more likely to be non-randomly audited by tax authorities than less wealthy individuals. So according to the Baker model, they should evade less. What we find is that they evade more. We think that to understand that, you need to shift the focus from the demand side of tax evasion to the supply side. So you need to think about what institutions like HSBC do, or UBS. What they do is that they cater to very wealthy individuals and they sell them some financial services, many of which are legitimate and legal, some of which sometimes are just conducive of tax evasion. The way they do that is that they organize, events, galas, concerts, sponsor concerts, golf events. And for those events, they don't invite me, they don't invite you, so who do they invite? That's the question that we try to think in this very simple model. So we're going to try to model the supply of tax evasion services, historically thinking about Swiss banks. Swiss banks, there was a cartel agreement that regulated the fees that the banks could charge, and so we modeled that as a monopoly. We also have a competitive model that doesn't make much difference to the qualitative results. You have a population of mass 1 with some density of wealth f of y. You have a monopoly of providers of tax evasion services. The banks that charge theta per dollar of wealth that they help hiding. We're going to shut down the demand side of the model by saying there is some infinitely elastic demand for tax evasion at price theta. And so what the cartel does is that it just optimizes on the number of clients that it's going to serve. And when the Swiss banks serve the top S% of the distribution, they manage K of S in wealth, and they earn theta times K of S in revenue. Okay, so the very simple idea of the model is that what these providers of tax evasion services do is that they internalize the cost of being caught. They have revenue, which if you have a bigger customer base, you have more revenue, so you want to have, to supply lots of tax evasion services, and you have costs. What are the costs? Is that with some probability, you're going to be found facilitating tax evasion. If you have too many customers, for instance, then the probability that there's a leak increases because you need to employ more people, and the risk that you have some, too ethical employee that's going to blow the whistle rises. Okay, and so what we say is that the probability to get caught is proportional to the number of clients served, and it's lambda times S, and if the bank is caught, then it pays a fine phi times K of S. K of S is the amount of wealth that it manages. And so what's optimal for the bank to do is to provide, if wealth is Pareto distributed, there is a very simple closed form solution to the cartel's problem that is the following. The supply of tax evasion services takes this very simple form, and what's very important, the most important thing to notice in that equation is just that the supply of tax evasion services is going to be a declining function of inequality. So when wealth is super concentrated, the inverted Pareto-Lorenz coefficient B is high, and so everything else equal, S is going to be small. So, if you have just a few billionaires who own, most of the world's wealth, that's going to be the potential customer base of the Swiss banks. If wealth is more equally distributed, then the banks are going to supply more tax evasion services. The second important thing to notice is that it's kind of a message of hope, is that the supply of tax evasion services, is going to to depend on the probability for the bank to be caught and the fine in case it is caught. And so if the fines are very high, let's say if a bank caught facilitating tax evasion is put out of business, which corresponds to an infinite fine in that model, you're going to have a zero supply. So that's a message of hope because it means that it's not so complicated to fight against tax evasion. You just make sanctions really big for the providers, for the facilitators of tax evasion. And so let me finish very quickly with the following. Does this mean, what happens? What would happen if indeed the tax authorities and countries followed this strategy? They increased fines for banks. Does that imply that wealthy people would pay much more in taxes? Well, that's going to depend on whether they legally avoid more, on the interplay between tax evasion and tax avoidance. You could imagine that if they can't evade, now they're going to find legal ways to just pay very little in taxes, and so it's hopeless to collect more revenue from the very wealthy. And so the way that we study this question is by looking at this big sample of Norwegians who used the tax amnesty since 2009, and they used to hide a lot of wealth. They decide to come clean. Question, do they start avoiding more? And so we have a very simple event study design where we follow over time the evolution of reported wealth, reported income, and taxes paid by this sample of people who used a tax amnesty. And what do we see? So we see that after using a tax amnesty, the amount of wealth that the former tax evaders report, boom, rises by 60%, okay? After the tax amnesty, the amount of income that they report, taxable income, boom, rises by 20%. In both cases, it rises just in line with what you would expect based on the amount of wealth that they were hiding and they disclosed during the amnesty. What about taxes? The same, they rise by more than 30%. The result here is that 4 years after the amnesty, this sample of tax evaders, they still pay 30% more in taxes. Okay, so at least in that context, and I'm not saying that tax amnesties are necessarily a great idea and that doesn't take into account the effect of amnesties on non-evaders and complicated dynamic effects, but at least in that particular setting, the treatment, on the treated, on the people who use the tax amnesty is strong and persistent. They pay much more taxes 4 years after using the tax amnesty. So my conclusion is this. In rich economies with little self-employment, tax evasion is small on aggregate, but it's high at the top with a strong gradient within the top 1%. This can be explained by a simple model where the suppliers of tax evasion services internalize the cost of being caught, and both the model and the evidence suggest that collecting more revenue from the wealthy might be possible under current law. And that's the last slide. This is Scandinavia. I don't have the time. Maybe during the questions we can talk about what we learn or don't learn about the US or the rest of the world. The point is that the data that we use in that research is available in many, many countries. And so these methods that were developed and these data sources that we used could be applied to the US, to other countries, to construct kind of similar distributional tax gaps. And the ultimate goal of all of this is to correct global inequality statistics, which right now don't take tax evasion into account at all. And the hope is that ultimately they will take into account plausible estimates of the amount of tax evasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It seems like you have to assume for this to be a correction that auditing is somehow a priori is not as effective only for the high wealth. If it's because what you do is you supplement it with a particular data set on a particular form of evasion that's only prevalent in very high wealth groups. But if auditing, a priori was equally ineffective across the distribution, missed say 30%, and then you just supplement at the high wealth end with particular forms for high wealth evasion, then it's not really a correction, is it? It's more of it could lead to more biased estimates of evasion, unless you have the a priori assumption that we're mainly missing evasion by the high wealth groups. It's
Okay, let me actually answer that question immediately. So it's totally true, that what we do is we take the random audit data, we take them as is, and then we supplement those using the leaks. And it's true, it's totally possible that the random audits not only miss some forms of tax evasion at the top, and by our estimates they do miss really a lot of tax evasion at the top, but also here. Okay, that's possible. Is it likely that they underestimate by a factor of 10 tax evasion in those wealth bins here? I mean, that's not the viewpoint of either tax authorities or people who've used these audit data so far. For the very simple reason that most people here in those wealth bins, they just can't evade taxes. Okay, if all the income that you get is wage income or pension income or interest and dividends earned in domestic banks, it's just impossible to evade taxes. And the tax authorities, at least the Danish tax authorities that we've been working with a lot, they're pretty confident that they do a good job here. That, yes, there's tax evasion and self-employment income, and they do find a lot. They find that 45% of the self-employed in Denmark evade taxes. And that's reflected in those numbers here. They do find a lot of tax evasion and self-employment income, but the point is self-employment income is so small on aggregate that it doesn't mean that there's a lot of tax evasion. So I take your point that maybe there's a bit more tax evasion here. Maybe it's not 1% here, maybe it's 4%. But what we find here is that for the very, very top bin, it's 30%. And I don't think it's likely that there are forms of tax evasion that are undetected here that could move those dots up to 30%.
One question about taxes rules are different in different countries, and people may choose where to have their fiscal residence. So they will disappear from the distribution, and perhaps you may have in your tax records those very rich which left the distribution. We may think of soccer players, singers, and so on. So they may have some bias in the distribution.
Yes, that's also a great question. So it's true that, that one way to avoid taxes, sometimes to evade taxes that's popular at the very top end of the distribution is to change our country of residency. For the US, it doesn't work because there's citizenship-based taxation, so wherever you live in the world, you're supposed to pay taxes to the IRS, but the US is the exception. Other countries, if you move away from Denmark, then you're not taxable anymore in Denmark. It's very important, and in all the data that I've showed, we've excluded non-residents. So we see quite a fair number of Scandinavian nationals, in particular in the HSBC list, that we can match to some administrative data, but they say, at least they claim to be non-residents, and so we remove them from our estimates, which I think is probably, a bit too extreme in the sense that one form of tax evasion that sometimes happens at the top of the distribution is to, falsely claiming that you are non-resident. Okay, so, but we've taken their word, seriously. We can't detect that form of tax evasion with the data we have, and so we've removed all non-residents. So all the series that I showed only include resident taxable individuals.
Thank you. I think that you concluded that all what you presented is valid if there is a low degree of self-employment. Now, if you are in Italy, which is my own country, the average income declared by small enterprises, artisans, shopkeepers, and so on and so forth is lower than what an unskilled laborer earns. And so a large part of the tax evasion occurs in the, let's say, bottom 50% of the distribution, 50, 60, 70%. So only people working for the formal sector or pensioners, or they pay it. And then, of course, there are some big cats that are evading. Now, what the tax office argues that if we were able to catch all the tax evaders, this would be people with low, medium level of income. And so if you correct the distribution, WID would give us a Gini which is lower than the one which we estimate on the basis of the surveys. So this to emphasize that Norway is one country and Italy is another. So that the nature of the correction could be the opposite of the one that you are somehow hinting at the end of the discussion. Is that correct?
So the pattern of tax evasion that's found in random audit data here in Scandinavia, and we've not discovered that. It's been studied quite a lot by many people before us. The only difference compared to the literature on random audits is that we rank people by wealth instead of taxable income. But if you look at studies in the US, the National Research Program, the NRP, the random audit studies that the IRS conducts, a number of people have studied these random audits, and they find a distribution of evasion that's relatively similar, that is slightly rising at the top of the income distribution. So that's what you find both in Scandinavia and in the US NRP. Again, these random audit studies have a lot of limitations that we've discussed. I think, tax evasion by self-employed people, it's important in countries like Greece, like Italy, in developing countries. In general, let me show you just a graph that might be helpful. So that's the graph that compares, the US with Denmark, with a similar, pattern in tax evasion in random audits. Now, here is a graph that shows the share of self-employment income in GDP in OECD countries. Denmark, which is the country that I've been using for the random audits, is here 5%. If self-employment is only 5%, that puts a big limitation. Even if all the self-employed evade, and they evade 100% of their income, that's not going to imply big rates of tax evasion overall. Now, this is Denmark. In Greece, in Poland, in Turkey, self-employment is 25% of GDP. And in that case, the graph here that I showed is likely to be different. That is absolutely true. Now, this dot will be maybe even higher in Greece than in Scandinavia. That's one possibility. Those dots here will also be higher. So I don't want to claim that this pattern here is a universal law. That's absolutely not my point. In Scandinavia, that's what we find. In countries which have a very low share of self-employment, this is likely to be close to the truth. Because just these people here, they can't evade a lot, and tax evasion is only possible here at the top. Okay, one more question. Yes.
I'm curious about your opinions on the implications of rewards for tax whistleblowers. As I'm sure you know, the IRS promises 15 to 30% of taxable taxes to collect for if it's greater than 2 million, which is a big payoff, like 300,000. Citing serious money requires the cooperation of a lot of people, some of whom are poorly paid. So does this alter the supply of tax evasion services to people of different nationalities? Does it have an impact on your estimates overall?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, it's true that the main way that tax authorities try to put pressure on the providers of wealth concealment services is by agitating the risk of whistleblowing and paying huge sums to whistleblowers. So for instance, the IRS paid $104 million to a former UBS banker who revealed tax evasion by Americans at UBS Switzerland. And that's a lot of money, and that's of course a big. He also went to jail, so it's not totally consistent incentives, but just the monetary incentives for whistleblowers, they are pretty high. That's for sure. Now, is it really enough? I'm not sure. I think that there are two problems. One problem is that if the fines that are imposed on banks like UBS and so on are too small, then that's not going to be enough to they make a cost-benefit analysis, and if whenever they're caught, they have to pay 900 million or 800 million, which is what UBS had to pay, this just pales in comparison to their profits. HSBC, was found found facilitating money laundering by Mexican drug cartels, and which is a really with huge sums involved, which is a really serious offense. And they got to keep their banking charter in the U.S. They had to pay $2 billion in fines to the U.S., but that same year in 2013, they made more than $20 billion in profits. Okay, so it's not clear that the fines are high enough. And the second problem, and I think the deeper problem, is that there is a view within the banks, and certainly maybe within, among some regulators, that big banks are just too big to indict. That is, it's not a good idea to take the risk to put a big bank like HSBC or UBS out of business, because it would, topple financial stability. It would destabilize world markets. And so what we've seen is that there's no big bank that's been put out of business, nothing like what happened, at the time of Enron, for instance. The regulators just don't take those risks. Now, if the banks internalize that, they are too big to indict, even if you have whistleblowers, that might not be enough for them to curb the supply of tax evasion services. Another strategy for them is just to move, these evasion services to like smaller divisions and to improve their internal systems and so on. So my view is that whistleblowing is not enough of a threat. What's critical is to find a way to impose really stiff sanctions for the facilitators of tax evasion. Thank you.